Hello and welcome to Understanding Plato. This is Lawrence Holgate, the author of the Smart Student's Guide to Philosophical Classics series. Understanding Plato is the first book in this 8-book series. This is going to be the 22nd episode of Understanding Plato, and in fact it's going to be the final episode. Recall that the test given to Socrates by Glaucon was to prove that the life of the just person is better than the life of the unjust person. And Glaucon goes on to say, I want you to prove this, Socrates, even if the just person has the reputation of being the most unjust person, and the unjust person has the opposite reputation of being just. So really his question is, how can justice be its own reward? How could injustice be its own loss or punishment in these cases in which the just person and the unjust person have been made to switch reputations? Well, Socrates, if you recall, way back in Book 4 of the Republic, he uses a lengthy analogy between the perfectly just city-state and the perfectly just soul, or person, if you wish, in order to make his case. The perfect city is one in which each person does the one task for which he or she is naturally suited, the one task in the city. So, for example, only those with the natural abilities to rule the city shall rule. When one person rules, it is called kingship, and when several persons who have this natural ability rule, the city is called an aristocracy. So it's a kingship or an aristocracy. But, as we now see in books 8 and 9, the cities can degrade. And this happens when the rulers fail to educate the next generation of rulers. It always happens in the ruling class, where the degradation of the city-state occurs. And the kingship, the perfect city that we've already described, in which each person is doing only the one task for which he or she is suited, that's the perfect city, where the king is naturally suited to be king, where the soldiers, ones with soldiers' abilities at soldiering and military duties, that they will do only that task in the city. Those with the ability to do commerce are called the wage earners in the city, and they do that single task. That's the largest group, by the way, of the city. But if we go back now, if that's the perfect city in which each person is doing only the task for which he is naturally suited, so Plato's assuming, of course, that we all have natural abilities and we ought to stick to them. And we've seen what happens when cities start being ruled by soldiers, when cities start being ruled by commercial people. It's always a disaster, he thinks. That's an empirical judgment, of course, but he does say it several times. So the city degrades. And the first degradation is from the kingship or aristocracy to timocracy, that is the city that is ruled by soldiers, by the military. Then we go down to oligarchy, where cities are ruled by the wealthy. They have a wealth requirement in order to rule. Then we go to democracy. Look how far on the scale democracy is. But Plato's democracy is really anarchy. It's where anybody can do anything he wants. If you want to rule, you can rule. If you don't want to rule, that's all right. And then finally, the one we haven't talked about is tyranny. That's the final stage in the destruction of the city-state, or the degradation of the city-state. It doesn't get destroyed until we reach tyranny. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to start at the conclusion or of Book 9. And I'm reading from my book, Understanding Plato, at page 147 if you have the paper version, and if you have the digital version, it's chapter 11, 11.1.4. with the title Tyranny. Plato does not give a complete definition of tyranny, but he chooses to describe some of the key features of tyrannical government. There is a standard dictionary definition. You can find it in almost any dictionary. It's always the same. Tyranny is government by a ruler or a small group of people who have unlimited power over the people in their country or state, and they use that power unfairly and cruelly. So this has a couple of elements to it. It's government by a ruler or small group of people who have unlimited power. They can do anything they want. There is no 10 amendments to their constitution, if there is a constitution at all. They have unlimited power over the people in their country or state, and they use that power cruelly and unfairly. Now, if that's tyranny, Socrates adds several observations about those who rule in a tyranny. The tyrants, in other words. First, his primary concern is to be constantly stirring up some war or other, so that people will be impoverished by war taxes, and they are compelled to concentrate on their own daily needs and be less likely to plot against him. If they're so impoverished, all they're going to do is think about themselves and how to find food, how to eat, how to raise their children. People who are confined to that are going to be much less likely to plot against the rulers. Second, the tyrant is going to destroy any free-thinking person who he suspects of rejecting his rule. And he does this by rigging false accusations against them. He'll take them to court and have them legally murdered. Third, the tyrant will use the sacred treasuries in the city for as long as they last, as well as the property of those he has destroyed. Fourth, except for those to whom he pays wages, he will lose his former friends, and the citizens of the city will come to hate him. They will plot to drive him out, and the tyrant will eventually need bodyguards. And here's a quote from the Republic, a straight quote, at section 569, paragraph 569c. And so the people, by trying to avoid the proverbial frying pan of enslavement to free men, have fallen into the fire of having slaves as their masters. And in exchange for the excessive and inappropriate freedom they had before, that is, in a democracy, they've given themselves the harshest and most bitter slavery. Now, let's switch from the tyranny of the city to the analogy, to the tyranny of the soul. What's that going to look like? Book 9 gives us the final argument against the character Thrasymachus back in Book 2, and all of those who contend that the life of the completely unjust person is the happiest and most profitable life for one to lead. And Thrasymachus said, if you recall from Book 2, that the life of the completely just person was the most miserable and least profitable. Well, that's Socrates' challenge, and here he's going to try to give a counter-argument. Socrates begins his counter-argument with a distinction among unnecessary pleasures and unnecessary appetites. He says that there are some of these pleasures and appetites that are lawless, meaning that, for example, they are appetites which, if satisfied, would violate law, moral and legal. Quote, these are probably present in all of us, but they are held in check by the laws and by our better appetites allied with reason. And once released and freed from all shame and reason, though, these are the appetites that cause us not to shrink from such things as having sex with a mother or with anyone else, man, god, or beast. Someone with this kind of appetite will commit any foul murder, and there is no food it refuses to eat. In a word, it does not refrain from anything, no matter how foolish or shameful. Paragraph 571d, Republic. Socrates believes that everyone has such appetites because they are the ones that wake us up when we sleep. especially if we are full of food and drink. The person with a tyrannical soul does in reality what most of us only dream about. But we have our nightmares in dreaming about these things. He casts aside the restraints of the spirited element of the soul, ignores the commands of reason, and acts on his lawless appetites. Socrates uses the word passion to describe the ascendance of the lawless appetites. Passion is a tyrant, serving as a captain of everything in the soul. The best analogy that Socrates can find is with a drunk or a mad and deranged man. And like these men, the tyrannical man recognizes no limits to his behavior. He is so much under the tyranny of passion that there is no terrible murder, no food, and no act from which he will refrain. He will steal, he will break into houses, he will snatch purses, steal clothes, rob temples, and kidnap people. This is the tyrannical soul. This is the tyrannical man with a tyrannical soul. Well, Socrates now poses the final question. Now we have a description of what it is to be a tyrant and what it is for a state to be tyrannical. Here's his final question. Bearing in mind the resemblance between the city and the man, the tyrannical soul is, quote, full of slavery and illiberality, with, like the city, those same parts enslaved, while a small part, the most wicked and the most insane, is master of the soul. The part that is master of the soul, let's repeat that, is the most wicked and the most insane. Because it is enslaved, it is least able to do what it wishes. The whole soul will be full of disorder and regrets, and it is always forcibly driven by a gadfly, the gadfly of passion, and maddened by his appetites and passions, the tyrannical man becomes the most wretched of all men. It's as if Socrates is describing the life of a psychotic. Socrates and Glaucon agree that they have now proved, or that Socrates, has now proved, that the kingly, the timocratic, the oligarchic, the democratic, and the tyrannical souls, all of them, are to be ranked in happiness by the order of their appearance on this list. The list that started with kingly souls and ended with tyrannical. And here's what he says. Here's what he writes in the Republic. The best and the most just is the most happy, and that he is the one who is most kingly and rules like a king over himself, whereas the worst and the most unjust is the most wretched. And he again is the one who, because he is the most tyrannical, is the greatest tyrant of himself and his city. Paragraph 580b, c. But Socrates does not want to stop here. He believes that there are other more powerful proofs that he can make of this claim. He doesn't want to just state it. He wants to prove it. So the second counter-argument against tyranny begins with a distinction previously made in Book 4 of Republic. It starts with a distinction between three kinds of pleasure. Each kind of pleasure is peculiar to each part of the soul. One part of the soul is that with which a person learns. Another part of the soul is that with which a person feels anger. That's the passionate part of the soul. And as for the third, called the appetitive part, Socrates says it is profit-loving because it needs to satisfy the appetites for food, drink, sex, and all the other things that go along with them. Socrates calls the first part or element learning-loving, the second is called victory-loving, and the third honor-loving. He then says that people can be divided into categories according to which of these desires rules the soul. Some people are philosophic. All the people listening to this podcast are the philosophic, aren't you? Other people are victory-loving, and the remainder are profit-loving. Second, there are three kinds of pleasure assigned to each of these. The philosophic has the pleasure of, guess what, learning. The victory-loving person has the pleasure of achieving victory or honor, And the remainder of the profit-loving people have the pleasure of, well, what else? Making a profit. Socrates now entertains us with a thought experiment. Suppose we ask persons in each group to tell us which of their lives is the most pleasant. Well, it's obvious that each would give the highest praise for his own. So we can't draw any conclusions about which life is the most pleasant by allowing all persons in each group to have a vote. The vote is always going to end up in a tie. So what Socrates recommends is that the only way to get an objective answer to the question of what life is the most pleasant is to establish the ground rule that only those who have already had the most experience of the pleasures we just mentioned should be consulted. Only those who have had experience of all these pleasures. Now, if we do this, then it becomes clear that only the philosopher has the most experience of the pleasure of knowing than the other two types. The philosopher has tasted the other kinds of pleasure beginning from childhood. So compared to the profit lover and the honor lover, the philosopher is the finest judge among the three types of men. Since the philosopher has already chosen his own life as the most pleasant, it follows that it is the most pleasant of the three types of life. Now, some people might say, well, look, I mean, hasn't Plato just rigged this whole election here if you're trying to decide? I mean, try to imagine going into the voting booth and somebody calls you out and says, you have not had the pleasure of knowing all of these people and their different pleasures. Okay, you don't get to vote. Well, these people don't all get to vote. Only the philosopher gets to vote, and the victory-loving and the profit-loving don't, because they've never experienced the pleasures of the philosopher. Whereas the philosopher presumably now has had all pleasures. And so only he gets to vote on what is the best, and he's choosing himself. Socrates has another argument now. Let's go to it. It's the final argument for the supremacy of the philosophic life. It involves the necessity of using reason to judge the desires of the other parts of the soul and resist any it determines to be detrimental. And the argument moves in three broad steps. So let's go slowly here. The first step establishes that pleasure and pain are not exhaustive contradictories, but they are opposites, separated by a calm middle that is neither pain nor pleasure. And this may sometimes seem false. The removal of pain can seem to be pleasant, and the removal of pleasure can seem to be painful. But Socrates argues that these appearances are deceptive. He distinguishes between pleasures that fill a lack and thereby replace a pain, and these are not genuine pleasures, he thinks, and those that do not fill a lack and thereby replace a pain, and these are genuine pleasures. So if you've been in pain, let's say, and the pain goes away, that's a kind of pleasure, but it's not a genuine pleasure. But if you have a pleasure that wasn't just a replacement of a pain, it just comes upon you, that's better. Those are genuine pleasures. The second step in the argument is to establish that most bodily pleasures, and the most intense of these, fill a painful lack, and they are not genuine pleasures. Finally, Socrates argues that the philosopher's pleasures do not fill a painful lack, and they are genuine pleasures. So most bodily pleasures, including the most intense, those are not genuine. But the philosopher's pleasures, the pleasures of understanding, of learning, they don't fill a lack, and they are genuine. Contrary to the Epicure's assumption, the Epicureans that we mean, the philosopher's pleasures are more substantial than just pleasures of the flesh. And I think that's all he's saying. Now, without the mastery and guidance of reason, the other elements would have no ability to discover their own pleasures. When one of the other parts gains mastery, Socrates says, the result is that we cannot discover its own pleasure, and he compels the other parts to pursue an alien and not a true pleasure. For example, if rational calculation or understanding is not in complete command, then the spirited element of the victory-loving person could never be satisfied. Quote, his love of honor would be colored by envy, his love of victory by violence, and the spiritedness by peevishness. But when the entire soul follows the philosophical part and does not engage in faction, the result is that each element does its own work and is just, and in particular, each enjoys its own pleasures, the best pleasures to the degree possible, the truest. Paragraph 586c. So now we come to the conclusion of books 8 and 9. And Plato concludes with the declaration that there is no sound argument for the claim that it profits someone to do injustice, or what is intemperate, or some shameful thing that will make him worse, even if it brings more money or power of some sort. Nor, Socrates says, can we claim that it profits him to be undetected in his injustice and not pay the penalty, because the one who remains undetected will become even worse, while in the one who is discovered and punished will have his bestial element calmed and tamed and the gentle one freed. So it's always better to confess, he's saying. His entire soul, when it returns to its best nature and acquires temperance and justice along with wisdom, that person will achieve a condition that is more honorable than that of a body when it acquires strength and beauty along with health. Now, these conclusions are at the end of a long philosophical discussion that began in the final paragraph of Book 1, when Socrates complained that he cannot say with certainty that justice is more profitable than injustice, because he says in that book that we do not yet know what justice is. So how can we talk about which is more profitable, justice or injustice? So encouraged by Glaucon, Socrates begins anew the argument for the profitability of justice over injustice in Book 2, which we've talked about. By the time we get to the end of Book 4, he's proposed and defended a theory of the tripartite soul, the parts of which do a kind of work which it is naturally suited for each part to do. Socrates used this theory to proclaim that justice in an individual is each part of the soul doing its own job where ruling and being ruled are concerned. This makes a stark contrast to injustice of the soul, in which the opposite condition prevails, with the non-ruling, appetitive part of the soul taking over the decision-making work of the rational part. And that's what took us to Book 9, the descriptions of the tyrannical soul in the final book of the Republic, the unjust soul writ large, shows in vivid terms the abject misery of those who suffer from the slavery of the most wicked and insane parts of the soul. That is the argument, and that is the end of this episode 22 and the end of the podcast on understanding Plato. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to you about my book and to read from it. And to repeat, if you'd like to get Understanding Plato or any of the other books in the series, they all begin with the word understanding. Understanding John Locke, I suspect that will be the next podcast, which I'll do after the first of the year. We have Understanding Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan will be the principal book we discuss from Thomas Hobbes. There's a book on John Stuart Mill, both a discussion of On Liberty and Utilitarianism. Understanding Immanuel Kant, which is one of my bestsellers. It's a short book, but Kant is very difficult, and I try to make him quite easy. Well, not that easy, but it's interesting and revolutionary, I think, some of the things that Immanuel Kant said and done. And David Hume, the next century. Hume was just a brilliant man who did the book on concerning natural religion, the dialogues concerning natural religion. Sorry, I'm forgetting the title of my own book. Understanding David Hume, the Smart Student's Guide to the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, and I stick in there a discussion of his essay on miracles. and his essay on suicide, and his essay on the immortality of the soul. All of those are in my book called Understanding David Hume. So, hey, look it up. You can find the whole series at Amazon.com. Since my name is so weird with a U, Houlgate, you can find my books on the Smart Students Guides easily in Amazon, and there's always a good description of them. So again, I'm rambling on. Thank you very much, and we'll listen to you, or you listen to me, and see you again in 2022. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.